Josh Hennig here on my YouTube channel at Josh Hennig. Of course, you catch me Monday through Friday on 97.3 ESPN, 6 p.m. on game night. So this is a special edition of a video we're making because I have my dad here. And I have my dad here on purpose because my dad is not a diehard football fan. He is not the kind of person who watches every game like I do and tracks every game. But he is someone who appreciates the intricacies of sports in general. And there was a specific observation I had, Dad, this weekend. So in college football and in the NFL, over 75% of all of the favorites this weekend have all lost. So I went back and looked at all the college football lines, all of the experts, the odds makers, the analysts, all the the people who are supposed to be smarting everybody, right?
Right.
And I went through all their numbers, and I realized a pattern. And the pattern is we are seeing right now a change in how we have to look at football. Because today, for example, in the Philadelphia Eagles game, when the Eagles won today, what happened in the Eagles game that needs to be understood, and I haven't rewatched the whole game yet, but I'm going to later tonight, is you saw a defense that was among the worst in the NFL the first 2 weeks of the season. They gave up a ton of yards. They were bottom third in the NFL in yards allowed and pressure rate and all these different metrics. So how does a defense go from being that bad for 2 straight weeks to all of a sudden now being a defense that is holding what was coming into this game one of the best offenses in the NFL to not a half of their scoring rate? Because remember, they were averaging over 40 points per game. Not a third of their scoring rate, a quarter of their scoring rate. They couldn't even get 20 points on the Eagles' defense. Okay. And I think I know the reason why.
And why is that?
It's because all of these analysts are analyzing football based on track record and not on matchups. In theory, the Eagles were supposed to be facing a similar offense today than what they faced last week. Because the offensive coordinator of the Saints, his name is Clint Kubiak, he comes from the same coaching tree offensively as the Falcons offense, and the same coaching tree as the Packers offense. So big picture, rewind it back to 1973. Little history lesson for everybody here, okay? And I know for some of you watching this is going to be above some of your interests, and I understand that this is not low-hanging fruit, okay? So let's backtrack it to when Bill Walsh, who is the creator of the West Coast offense, he was trying to run this offense in Cincinnati. But he had trouble having success running that offense because he at first thought the problem was the quarterback. He learned over time that it was not as much about the person executing the offense, but it was about the people all together in the offense, because football is a team sport.
Right.
Because if you go back to the origins of football, if you go back to when Teddy Roosevelt brought all of the college professors and presidents to the White House and sat them down and basically told them, you need to fix football or I'm going to make it illegal. He brought in military generals to these men to explain to them why football and the military and team sports are good for young men in their development. And part of the reason why there's a connection between the military and football, and the reason why in the first, I would say, 50 years of football, so if you go, let's say, like 1890 to 1940, the reason why during that era we had this change from football being basically just a variation of rugby to what we see today is because all of these military men started getting into football. There is a level of strategy that comes with football. Bill Walsh picked up on understanding that because he was working with a coach named Paul Brown at the time with the Bengals. And Paul Brown was a very regimented and structured individual. He learned it from the military academy. And Paul Brown is the reason we had coaches like Vince Lombardi and Tom Landry and Bill Walsh and many others who were very successful in football. Because he kind of created the structure blueprint. You follow what I'm saying?
I follow that, but what does that have to do with the game today?
So the reason why this has something to do with the game today is because when Bill Walsh realized that it was all 11 players that were important and not just the one guy throwing the ball, he created the West Coast offense that changed the entire league. Because what the West Coast offense does is it creates mismatches with matchups. It forces the defense to have to constantly adjust to what you're doing.
So the Eagles expected the kind of defense,
Offensive attack
that they would
already be bringing. Because they've already seen variations of it.
And they've already got busted up a few times.
Correct.
With it, so they learned their lesson.
Right. And the reason why the Bill Walsh point is important is because the man so if you think of Bill Walsh as like a tree, there's all these branches that come off the tree, right?
Right.
So, for example, one of the branches, not the branch we're talking about here, but one of the branches was Mike Holmgren. Mike Holmgren hired a guy who had never been a coordinator, had never coached, like play calling offensively, never played quarterback. His name is Andy Reid. And no one ever heard of him before. But he became the quarterback coach in Green Bay.
Mm.
He was then hired by the Eagles back in 99. And people didn't know who Andy Reid was because, like, why are you hiring a quarterback coach to be a head coach? Well, now, basically 20 plus years later, Andy Reid's going to go to the Hall of Fame one day. And Andy Reid has brought a version of that Bill Walsh offense.
So there are different offense
offshoots, yes.
Groups
yes.
or types.
Correct.
Just like you have military campaign types.
Mm-hmm.
And so which one would you say the Eagles fall into?
Well, we'll get to the Eagles offense in a minute. But I'm focusing on the defense still, what the defense was facing.
Okay.
So, on the other side of those branches, so let's say one side of the branches are the Andy Reid, Mike Holmgren, all those guys.
And how would you typify them?
So, the Andy Reid offense, and I'm not explaining it as deeply as someone who's played or coached in that offense is because I'm trying to simplify it here. What Andy Reid does best is Andy Reid creates chaos pre-snap. He basically has a lot of moving parts pre-snap.
So has the offense or the defense being
unsure.
Unsure.
Correct.
So he introduces the element of uncertainty.
Correct.
And or surprise.
Right. And one of the reasons why historically tight ends have done well in Andy Reid's offense. Right now, Travis Kelce, who plays for the Chiefs, he's going to go to the Hall of Fame one day, is because of the fact that in many situations, you don't expect the ball to go to the tight end in some of these setups.
Right.
So one of the things they might do on a play specifically is, for example, if it's 1st and 10, so you need, obviously 10 yards to get the first down, but the tight end stays in to block. He doesn't go straight out onto his route.
Well, that's a general tactic, I think, regardless of the campaign style or the play style.
But Andy Reid has perfected it.
Okay.
So what Andy Reid does is Andy Reid will make you think, okay, the tight end is just there blocking. He'll only block for, let's say, one Mississippi and then immediately release.
Which is one of the reasons why you study the way other coaches or other teams play.
And now you're catching on to why the Eagles did well today. So on the other side of that tree,
okay.
So Andy Reid's on the one side, him, Mike Holmgren, all these guys. On the other side of the tree is the Mike Shanahan side. So Mike Shanahan initially learned part of the West Coast offense, but morphed it when he went to the Denver Broncos and won 2 championships with John Elway in the 90s.
And what made that, how was that different?
So Shanahan was less focused on the idea of, in Andy Reid's system, he doesn't just create chaos, but he also throws the ball to set up the run. Mike Shanahan doesn't create chaos as much pre-snap. He does 2 things differently. Instead of creating chaos, he hides players pre-snap. So, for example, one of the reasons why when John Elway won those Super Bowls, he had a Pro Bowl tight end, a Pro Bowl running back, arguably the best offensive line of that era, and 3 high-caliber receivers on the outside, is because of the fact that Mike Shanahan would hide his true intentions pre-snap. He would create a formation that would make you think, we're going to run the ball or we're going to pass the ball here, and he would do the opposite of what you think.
So instead of just adding the element of potential confusion, he will, Shanahan, or that style,
correct,
would present a misleading play
correct
type, so that the other team would then go for something that was not really going to take place.
Correct.
And it was known beforehand.
Correct.
Okay.
The other thing he would do is, instead of using the pass to set up the run, Shanahan used the run to set up the pass. That's why Mike Shanahan, there was like a 6-year run where no matter who the running back was, I mean, you had Terrell Davis, you had Mike Anderson, you had Landis Guerra, you had Clinton Portis. Every running back who was behind that system rushed for like over 1,000 yards, year in and year out. It was like a plug-and-play system. So what happened was, so Mike Shanahan's son, Kyle, is now coaching the 49ers in the league. And then back in the day, Mike Shanahan was the offensive coordinator. Sorry, Mike Shanahan's offensive coordinator, not Shanahan. Shanahan was head coach. His coordinator under him, the guy who worked under him, his name was Gary Kubiak.
Oh.
So Gary Kubiak and Mike's son Kyle have created another descend from Mike Shanahan. So the last 3 weeks, the Eagles have faced 3 offensive play callers who all come from the Shanahan side of the tree.
Okay.
So week 1, you had the Packers. They run a variation of the Shanahan system. Because everyone puts their own little spin on it. But the concepts are still very basic. Not basic, but they're all very similar.
Right.
So week 2, same thing with the Falcons. Now, the Eagles held the Falcons to less points than they allowed versus the Packers.
Okay.
So you went from giving up 30 points. Then you get down to 22 points. Now today you're in the teens. Why is this? Because now you have given a veteran defensive coordinator in Vic Fangio multiple looks at the same concepts, ideas. And he's getting multiple opportunities to see how his players react and respond and function within those environments. And so the huge reason why today the Eagles defense was able to not just stop the Saints from marching down the field and winning the game, but getting an interception and ending the game, whereas they couldn't do it last week against the Falcons, was because Vic Fangio, who has probably forgotten more football than some of us even know. I mean, the guy's been coaching football since the 1980s in the USFL before he got to the NFL. And, I mean, this guy had great defenses with the Indianapolis Colts, San Francisco 49ers, the Chicago Bears, and now he's with the Eagles. So the guy has seen a lot of football. And what happens is the more you see, the more recall you have. You know, for example, it's like in baseball, the more a hitter sees a certain pitcher, the more he's going to recognize certain patterns, certain trends, right? You know, it's like, for example, you know, for those who don't know, my dad, he was a computer tech programmer for years. And you know, as someone who sees programming, there's a fundamental commonality between some of these programs, right? Principles, right. There's fundamental principles underlying all of the fluff that people see.
Right.
It's the same thing with
logic.
The what?
The logic.
The logic. It's the same thing with football. There are underlying principles. There are underlying, we call them concepts in football or schemes. And so when you see something for 3 straight weeks, you're going to have the opportunity to make adjustments. And I made the comment this week, Dad, that Vic Fangio saying, I have to do a better job coaching the guys. I admit, I was unsure what that meant. I kind of felt like, here's Andy Reid telling us he's got to do a better job coaching the guys, right? Because that was what Andy Reid was infamous for during his days in Philadelphia. And people get mad at Andy because he would sit there and say, I got to do a better job coaching. And people would be like, what does that even mean, Andy? But, well, Andy's a Hall of Fame coach now, so I think what he means is, I'm going to fix this, right?
Right.
So now you bring it to a coach like Fangio, who himself is in his 70s. Fangio's even older than Andy is, which is wild in and of itself. So when you have a coach who has seen that much, I came into this season saying, I'm going to trust Vic Fangio. And I had a little doubt this week because I was trying to decipher what he meant by I have to coach the guys better. I have to put them in better position to be successful. In my mind, I'm thinking, and I'm admitting I was incorrect about this. In my mind, I was thinking, you had all offseason to coach these guys up. You had them in off-season training activities. You had them in minicamp. You had them in training camp. You had them in preseason. You're with them every day for months. In my mind, I'm thinking, based on what he was saying, I almost thought it was a cop-out. I almost thought it was him just saying, I don't want to tell you what I'm doing, but I'm going to figure this out. But now I realize he was actually being more literal than we realized. What Fangio was really trying to say was, I already see the problem. And now it's my job to coach these guys, to put them in a position to fix the problem that I see.
Well, I think they need to return to the basics. And as I was alluding to before, you've got to study the other team's dynamic.
Correct.
What they tend to do, how they play, and particularly how the coaching is, or the management, because there are certain teams will have different coaches will have certain types of plays,
certain tendencies,
as well as the players. So the players themselves, under the tutelage of the coaching staff,
right?
It's fine to learn techniques of plays, but you've got to study the opposing team.
Right.
In any type of war situation, you know your enemy.
Right.
You want to counter or to prepare to get around them. You need to know what they're likely to do.
Right. Well, but for example, you know, I finished reading that book about Ulysses Grant, And one of his greatest tools in the Civil War was the fact that every general in the Confederate Army at one point or another was at West Point with him.
Right.
So he knew every single one of these guys personally. And he also realized, and not to get a full history lesson here, but I'm going to bring it back to what happened with the Eagles today, because it's important. He realized at Grant that every single one of them made fun of him because he did not believe in the Napoleon style of warfare.
Okay, most people don't know what that is.
So for those who, really quick, Napoleon, who was the emperor dictator of France from about 1799 through the early 1800s, and he was a conqueror and a despot, and he was a bit of a monster. But that's not the point. The point is that his style of military warfare was very well respected. And there were a lot of people who brought his ideas to West Point. And they were teaching those ideas at West Point. And Grant had the luxury, and this is where knowing and seeing things before. Grant had the luxury of seeing the flaws of that style of warfare during the Mexican-American War, which occurred 15 plus years before the Civil War.
No, it's just similar with different types of martial arts. You have this, the same situation where you have pluses and minuses of various techniques.
So, but back to the point, which is, so imagine if the Napoleon style of warfare is similar to the Shanahan offense.
Right.
You have all of these people, Kyle Shanahan, Clint Kubiak, Matt LaFleur, all of these guys who all run, Mike McDaniel, he's another one down with the Miami Dolphins. The Falcons run this type of offense. All of these coaches run this style. So, like Grant, who went into the Civil War when he finally was promoted to general of the entire army, because at the time Lincoln said, "We're losing the war. You guys are idiots. We need a competent man. The only competent man is Grant. He's the only one winning any battles." So that's when he promoted him. People were mad at him because, like, why are you bringing this drunken buffoon to the head of the army? But like Fangio, who has seen this all before, Grant saw it all before.
Right.
Grant knew exactly what the strategy was. He knew exactly what the system was, and everyone made fun of him because he didn't believe in that system, Grant.
Right.
And like Fangio said, "Trust me, I have an answer for this. Trust me, there is a solution to this, what seems to be unstoppable system." So what Fangio has done with the Eagles and said, "Listen, week 1, you got 30 points on me. Week 2, you got 22 points on me. Today, you're in the teens. You got 12. So each week, he's actually gotten better. So even though the metrics and the analytics and the experts are saying, well, the Eagles are one of the worst defenses at this category and that category, the reality was, if we would have looked at the matchup closer and realized that Fangio is slowly bringing this defense into the idea he had formulated for it.
Okay.
And he's slowly putting these guys into position to be more successful, because today, for example, Jalen Carter had his best game of the year. The controversial defensive lineman first-round pick that some people had wondered, was that a wasted pick by the Eagles? Was that a failure? Fangio now was able to take this guy with oodles of talent. Like, the sky's the limit for Jalen Carter. This guy could be a future Hall of Famer, talent-wise. Just pure talent. But as we know, talent is not enough to be successful at anything.
Right.
So what Fangio did is, when he was telling us this week, I got to coach these guys up better, what he was saying is, I'm going to go to Jalen Carter and every single one of the guys in this defense, and I'm going to tell them, here's what's coming. Because I've seen this. I watched it come. If you listen to me, we're going to get this figured out. The Saints scored only 3 points through the first 70% of the game, which is insane. In today's NFL, where even the New York Giants went on the road and scored over 20 points on a good defense in Cleveland. A Giants team that's not very good. For you to do that is impressive. And it goes back to the reason why this weekend all of these quote-unquote favorites lost. It's the same reason why the Eagles won. It's because the University of Michigan, they said 2 weeks ago, we got just completely run over by the University of Texas. Now USC is coming to play us. USC runs a similar offense. Okay? In college, USC head coach Lincoln Riley, Texas head coach Steve Sarkisian, they both run variations of the same offense. So Michigan took a fool me once, fool me twice type of idea. Michigan dominated that game in the fundamentals of the game yesterday. It was a masterclass in them saying, we now know how to beat what's coming at us. And where people like myself said, man, I saw Texas run all over Michigan and make them look at weeks ago. I'm going to assume USC, who has similar talent, can do the same. What I forgot, Dad, is that they run similar offenses.
Oh, okay.
So now it goes to another college game from yesterday. Colorado. The controversial Coach Prime, Deion Sanders. Half the world hates him because he's boldly himself. He's a bit of a cult of personality. I will give him that. You know, and not to get political on here, but people like Deion Sanders, Donald Trump, Conor McGregor, these are polarizing individuals. So they because of the nature of who they are, they generate very intense emotions about them. Because they're very boldly who they are. They don't compromise to make people happy.
Right.
So Coach Prime or Coach Sanders, whatever nickname you want to give him, because it depends on what side of the love and hate diagram you fall on, he has a team that has flaws. And those flaws were exposed the first 2 weeks of the college football season. Now, they won the first game. They were able to overcome those flaws. The second game, they got completely dominated by Nebraska. And people were saying, Coach Sanders doesn't know what he's doing. Coach Sanders doesn't belong coaching a major program in college football. But what they forgot is, Coach Sanders has something that the average person mocking him doesn't.
What's that?
He has a good support staff.
Ah, okay.
He has smart people who he hired to help him do this job. And just like, for example, with the Philadelphia Eagles, the defensive coordinator doesn't do all the work. He has position coaches under him. They have assistants under them who gather film, who cut up tape, who give them information. People were making fun of Vic Fangio of the Eagles a couple months ago because they asked him about, hey, you've had a lot of guys who have worked under you. And they said, what is really the difference between what running their version of your offense and what is your defense and what you run? Fangio said, well, I don't share all my information of, basically saying, I don't share the secret formula with everybody. And people were like, wait a minute, you don't share it with everybody? He's like, no. Very just matter of fact. And it was kind of like a running joke. It was like, wow, Fangio is so, as the kids would say, he was so in his bag. He's so in tune with what he is doing that he didn't feel it was important to share certain information with everybody. But because of that, the more time people spend with him, you notice the coaches who spent more time with Fangio, just like with Shanahan, just like with any of these guys, the better they become as coaches. Because it almost like it rubs off on you. You see the work ethic, you see the thinking. It's like if anybody, if you work with somebody for 2 years versus 6 years, there's a different level of professional experience you draw from them, right?
Right.
So, bringing it back to college, what did Deion Sanders do? He never said I was the smartest coach in the world. What Deion said is, I'm going to hire someone like Pat Shermer, who coached in the NFL for years. He's going to be my offensive coordinator. Hey, I'm going to go get this coach, I forget his name, from Alabama. He coached under Nick Saban for like 12 years. And this guy is going to bring Nick Saban's style of structure to my defense. So what Deion said is, I'm not here to run everything. I'm here to put people in positions, so I will oversee them. I'm going to delegate to those people. So what did Sanders do? Sanders, coming out of the 2 games where they were exposed, he said, all right, coaches, what are we seeing? Let's reevaluate. Let's diagnose. He has now won 2 straight games. The one last week over their bitter rival, Colorado State. Colorado versus Colorado State is actually one of the oldest rivalries in college football. Most people don't know that because we live in a society where anything in college football that happens west of the Mississippi River, people forget about it exists. But, because people are sleeping
Right.
at a certain time of night. But the Colorado versus Colorado State rivalry goes back a very long ways. But they came out of that game and they played way better than anyone expected. So then they come into this week and they're playing a team in Baylor that is very well coached by David Aranda. David Aranda is one of these fundamentals guys. Like he's not very flashy. He's not very, ooh, look at all the fancy stuff I'm doing. Remember the chaos that Andy Reid does pre-snap, right?
Right.
Well, David Aranda doesn't do anything fancy pre-snap. He basically walks in and says, this is what we're doing. It's on you to beat us at the fundamentals of the game. So Baylor and Colorado are going back and forth. And let's be realistic, there were some bad referee calls in that game, okay? There was a call that should have been targeting, with the leading of the helmet, which is against the rules. But they didn't call it at one point. So there was stuff like that happening. Okay, we understand that. I'm just going to put it out there. But Colorado persevered, found a way to tie the game at the end of regulation, and they won the game in overtime. But it's because what is the difference between what Colorado saw versus what Michigan saw? They didn't see the same offense and defense every single week.
Right.
So now there's a bit of an adjustment that goes with that. So now you're recalibrating to every single variable. So unlike Fangio, who saw the exact same concepts, as they call it in football, for 3 straight weeks, or like a team like Michigan, who saw the same concepts 2 of the last 3 weeks, Colorado, for 4 weeks, saw basically the equivalent of going from, to use computer terms, Windows to Apple to Linux. Are they all operating systems? Yes. But do they all have their own different variables and...
They're right.
Right? So that's what it was for Colorado. They're going from Windows to Apple to Linux. I mean it in that order.
Right.
For a purpose. For those who don't know, certain operating systems, they don't use the same fundamental concepts as others. There's a reason why they don't. So for those who don't know, you cannot run a Apple program or an Apple application on a Windows operating system because they're coded differently, right?
Well, there was a time.
But what I mean is you can't download.
Well, they're based on different architectures.
Right, correct. Architecture, that's the better word.
Right, and sometimes they have interfaces which will enable you to translate one.
But it still has to be translated.
Right.
It doesn't come as is that way.
No.
So for example, if you're someone who has an Android phone, right? and you want to download Apple Music,
You
you can't go to the Apple Store and download the Apple version. You have to download it from the Google Play Store to get the
app,
Google translated version
right,
on your phone.
right, for the application.
Correct. So it's the same thing when it comes to football. In football, some of this stuff has to be translated when you're going from point A to point B to point C, or A, B, C, you know. So while Fangio had a linear connection between three different offenses to plan for.
Right.
And while Michigan saw the same system 2 out of 3 weeks, Colorado has now seen 4 straight weeks of 4 different systems.
Right.
So naturally...
So they're automatically going to be a little bit edgy when it comes to what to expect. Again, unless they spend more time
right.
looking at how the team that they're going to be playing next
right.
has been operating.
And this is why, moving forward, I think the answer is we need to start evaluating the matchups and not get so hung up on, well, the first 2 weeks of the Eagles season, they were 30th in the NFL in quarterback pressure rate. Because if the goal of the game, as Herm Edwards said, you play to win the game, okay? If the goal of the game is to win every week, it might not always aesthetically look a certain way. And I'll get in tomorrow on game night on 97.3 ESPN about why the Eagles offense have problems today, because that's not a conversation we're having right now. Okay, that's a whole different video.
Oh yeah, that could go on for a while.
Because the Kellen Moore offense is actually, for those who don't know, Kellen Moore's offense is different than 90% of the offenses in the NFL. And that's part of the Eagles' problem.
Okay.
But
again, that's for another.
But sticking with the defensive side of the ball, we were so critical of Vic Fangio. You know, how could you allow the Falcons to score at the end of the game? Darius Slay, does he still have it in him? You know, C.J. Gardner-Johnson, he's over pursuing. The Eagles' defensive line, they were not set up properly to stop the run. You know, all these issues we had coming out of the Falcons game. It was less of an issue in the Packers game because people kind of just took that as, well, it's the first week of the season. You know, it's your first game with all these guys. You're playing on not a good field. The field down in Brazil was not good. That was a big talking point. I guess, I don't know if you heard that one or not, but as you can imagine, playing football on a soccer field might be problematic.
That could be.
Yeah. So that's a simple answer to that. But the larger point is that coming out of the Falcons game on Monday night, there's all this consternation about what is going on with the Eagles defense. And as I watched the Eagles game, I realized that this is the reason why. The matchups matter. The scheme matters. The who, what, where, and why matters more so than the track record right now.
Right. Well, and two, the team, and the staff of the team have got to see how the team players are executing in actual games, not just practice scenarios. And then there's an adjustment process where they evaluate that and then move forward.
Well, it's like a science project where, you know, sure, certain outcomes may happen in a controlled environment, but in a non-controlled environment, how do the variables impact?
Right.
And now the scientists have to take notes.
Right.
If I add too much of this element versus that element in uncontrollable environments, how does that impact?
Right.
Same thing in football. It's the idea that you just said. Fangio now had 2 weeks of data or information or film or whatever you want to point to figure this out.
Right.
And now you took an offense that had scored I think it was the fourth most points in NFL history in the first 2 weeks of the season. They scored 40 plus points on the Carolina Panthers. They scored 40 plus points on the Dallas Cowboys. And versus the Eagles, it was in the teens.
Right.
So I think that is the larger reason why the Eagles won today, was understanding that we need to stop looking at teams as favorites and underdogs and start looking at them more as what is the matchup? Who are these coaches? Who are the people involved in producing this outcome?
Right.
And I think the reason why I brought my dad in, as I said, is because my dad understands non-football strategy and concepts and analytics and programming, and he can bring that, I can bounce that off of you and bring it into the sports environment.
Right.
Because I said, and this is not a negative against you. You're not somebody who sits down and just watches every game.
No. But again, the fundamentals, the type of plays,
Right.
the strategies are the same regardless of the form you are placing them in.
And again, I'm not saying this doesn't excuse any players for not doing their job.
No,
players still
well,
have to
again,
execute.
Again, can go into all different aspects. Can dedicate whole shows on different aspects. So,
Right.
It's your point, however, is very well taken. We've got to stop just looking at the outcome and begin to pay more attention to the ongoing dynamics and learn from that. The teams have to do that, the players have to do that, the coaching staff have to do that, and I think the people watching the games too, because I think they will miss the meat of an actual game.
Right.
If they're just looking at the icing of the cake, the outcome, or the hoopla, or what have you. So, that being said, very well put.
Well, thanks to my dad for joining me here on this video. I'll be back on 97.3 ESPN tomorrow, producing Mike Gill on the Sports Passion in the afternoon, and then with game night at 6 p.m. on 97.3 ESPN. And right here on my YouTube channel, at Josh Hennig. Like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed our conversation. And I'll catch you next time.